Welcome to Praise Hands, home of the Praise Hands, where we are all about creative, cross-cultural Christianity. I'm your host, Robbie Valderrama. And on behalf of the entire Praise Hands team, we want to welcome you to Season 3 of the Praise Hands podcast. Here on the show, we examine the American intersection of church, race, music, and economics, and we're thrilled to have you on this journey with us. If you want to learn more about what we do, visit praisehands.com or follow us on Instagram at praisehandsofficial. Well, we got a great show ready for you. Let's jump on in. Hello, Praise Hands. Today I'm live with Brooke Hempell. She is the Senior Vice President of Research at Barna Group, which is a leading research organization focused on the intersection of faith and culture. Hello there, Brooke.
Hey, good morning. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. So we met at Q in 2019, I think it was, and you shared a lot of fascinating things in your presentation. And specifically here on the podcast, we talk about the American intersection of church, race, music, and economics. And I thought it'd be really valuable to have you come in and speak to our listeners. You are able to provide some data to answer some questions about some of these topics that are maybe discussed more arbitrarily or opinion-based. And I think that it might be really clarifying for people to get in touch with some of the research that you put many hours in, you and your team, into mining for us. And I'm excited for us to learn from your expertise.
Thanks. Yeah, it's great to be able to share that with you.
So in addition to being a researcher, you're also actively involved with church planning as well as racial reconciliation ministries. So 2 questions. First, what does that look like for you? And second, how important do you think it is for people that are involved more in the academic or intellectual spaces to also be involved at a grassroots level in their cities?
Oh, gosh. I'm going to answer your second question first because that is a no-brainer for me. It is essential. So ironically, my goal as a researcher is to remain unbiased. And so you would think the best way to be unbiased is to remove yourself from everything. But the reality is there are things that I will not see when I look at data unless I see them in the world. And so being involved at the grassroots level helps me to really understand people's lived experience. Every data point tells someone's story. And so I need to be able to understand that story better. So for me, living in Atlanta, it is just the intersection of civil rights and church and Southern culture. And so I've really appreciated growing up in that environment and being here now and engaging in what I would call almost like an innovation lab in those spaces, right? So people are constantly developing new initiatives and new ways of kind of addressing these issues. And I think people are just more aware around me because of being in the birthplace of civil rights from that perspective. So for me, what that looks like is both very local and then also a little more with a view to the national. I will start with my smallest and really favorite ministry, which is an after-school program at a church that is in an incredibly blighted neighborhood. And one of the things I just love going there because it gives me a picture. One of the things I love is that this is a rough place to grow up. It's a very, very economically depressed neighborhood. And yet, on one side of the neighborhood sits the tower of Coca-Cola and all of its corporate wealth. And then Georgia Tech, which is all of these institutional minds solving the world's problems. And yet, in their backyard, literally, is this neighborhood. So I love being there. I love getting to know the kids there and getting to know the families and going, gosh, there's actually far less that separates us than this picture would suggest. So that's one way. That's my favorite, honestly. And then Atlanta, like I said, has a lot of different initiatives. We have a group called One Race, which is basically a collaboration of churches that I've just loved being a part of them. And then they kind of network with other groups. So the AND campaign gets involved in particular civic issues in the city as well as nationally. So that's been a great resource. And then this is where the church planning part comes in. So I've always loved church planning. I've always loved to be involved with that and supporting that. I love meeting church planners. They are just visionaries. It's so exciting to hear their vision. But in Atlanta and actually a lot of places, one of the things we see is that a lot of the racial reconciliation work is being done by church planters who are trying to create an environment where we can work that out. And so I work with and attend a group that meets once a month of church planners throughout the city. And we literally co-coach each other. We mentor each other and share our experiences and give suggestions on how to navigate certain situations. And so I would say probably half of the people in that room are intentionally planting diverse churches that reflect a neighborhood where they're going. And that's a really beautiful picture.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear you're involved with One Race. I was curious if you were. We had them on the podcast last semester, and I'll actually be doing a lot of work with them over this next year. So we'll have to huddle up about that.
That is awesome.
Yeah,
love that.
That's so cool. So on the flip side of that, let's ask this question: how do you then prevent the data points that you are seeing to then not make you more biased towards your particular lens through that? Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, it's true. It's just a constant battle. I think for me, the best way to do it is actually to bring a diversity of perspectives to the table. Mm-hmm. So when we work on a project, I will try to call out what I think my bias might be. It's usually more than I'm aware of, but at least be like, I need to watch out for this.
Sure.
And then find someone who might have a very different perspective and invite them in, either to help me interpret the data or to look at what I've said about something and saying, how does that sit with you?
Right.
So, for example, right now we're doing some research on historically Black churches, and their experience is just a totally different experience. And it's even different than a multi-ethnic environment, of course. And so I will look at the same piece of data and they will see something different than I see. And I want that. It helps me balance my own biases. And so I think that's to me probably better than pretending like I don't have them and trying to wipe them clean, because it's just not realistic.
Yeah.
Our experience does shape our lens. And
right.
I struggle hard against it, but I just have to be cognizant of that.
Yeah, no, that's really good. The reason why I'm kind of drilling into this is one of the first episodes that we've had specifically talking about data. And on this show, we're all about creative cross-cultural solutions. And so the reason why I think data is so important is that we want to make sure that we're solving the right problems and that we are getting good information. So if you look at the studies you guys are doing or other research institutions, how do you make sure that the funding source of that research doesn't paint a picture of reality that only reflects the topics and angles that people with money want to hear about?
Yeah, it is a little tricky. There's value for what we don't do, which is academic research. Right. Academic research, yes, it may have funding sources, but it's a lot more neutral. It's institutional. And so I think there's value in that in painting a really, really broad picture, and then allows us to kind of double click on certain areas. So we actually look to other sources to also kind of balance what we're looking at in terms of a particular study. So we'll say, all right, this is a thing we're studying, but we're giving it this broader context of looking at academic sources, looking at Census Bureau data, giving it a broader context so that we're not just looking at this one thing. And so for us, that kind of helps level set the playing field.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, but also just being aware of that. And it's a wrestling match sometimes. We know we're going in, if we're working with a particular partner who maybe has a certain approach to the way that they do relief work. We go, that's great, but not everyone's going to have this approach. So we have to constantly be on guard for, what's the broader story here? Because this is just one angle on it. So it's a balance. I think we also try to just own that, hey, we did this in partnership with this particular organization. And so knowing that some of the questions we're even asking are in line with some of their objectives. But for our team, we have a lot of people who come out of academia who really value that. So we bring all that with us into the study to give us a broader lens.
Yeah, no, that's really good. And one of the other studies that you referenced is a study from a group called Prosperity Now. I think they're based in Washington, D.C. And one of the questions that we get on this topic of economics is the trickle-down effect real? Or to what extent is it real? Who is it benefiting? Who is it not benefiting? And as it relates to the two topics of race and economics, which in this country have been very intertwined and almost inseparably, how do we ask and answer that question of, is overall economic growth affecting everyone equally? And is everyone getting a slice in the pie? And so a stat that you shared from Prosperity Now was that despite the astronomical growth in the city of Dallas's economy over the last couple of decades, the median income for Black residents in that city fell about $10K between 1980 and 2016. That's just mind-boggling. Yeah. How do you even start to talk about this?
So first of all, I just have to tell my personal story in that particular discovery, because it was an eye-opener for me. I was looking at some broad data, like demographic data and income and housing and whatever data. And I was like, what's this going on here in Dallas where there's so much growth and the poverty rate is like double the rest of the country? What's going on? And so you look at the top level stats and you go, wow, Dallas is thriving. And it was a good wake-up call for me as a researcher to always just look further. And this is the thing that I've really come out of almost that experience with as a maxim is averages only tell the average story, but they don't tell a minority story. It's actually nearly impossible for them to tell a minority story because a minority has a smaller voice in an average, just statistically, right? So if I want to understand everyone's lived experience, I need to look at those different audiences and understand what each of them is experiencing. So the data you're referencing, I found just by digging into some articles that were being published in Dallas, and I could not believe how the population growth had, really just diverged by ethnic group. And then, as you said, their economic prosperity had really diverged. And we kind of conceptually know that, not everyone shares equally, but that just struck me in the face of, and I don't want to be judgmental if someone lives in Dallas and is in a comfortable position, but how can there be this much wealth and this much suffering in the same city? Why isn't there a better sharing of that? Especially from a Christian perspective. For me, that just matters so much that what are we getting all that wealth for? That's not for us. That is to be a blessing to others. So it just really raised my awareness of digging into individual ethnic groups and seeing their story. It is true, and there's actually quite a lot of research that says the rising tide does not lift all ships when it comes to economics. There are some ways in which it does get an economy moving, but then additional civic steps have to be taken to ensure that that gets fairly distributed. And Atlanta suffers from some of the similar problems where, certain neighborhood, the one that I go to, English Avenue, is particularly blighted. They finally started getting investment when they decided to build an expensive, swanky new stadium in their neighborhood. We'd been advocating for decades for someone to notice this neighborhood, and only when the money came did everyone start cleaning up the neighborhood. And so it really was a call to advocacy in my mind, of looking around and knowing not just what's directly in your neighborhood, but knowing your city, going to those neighborhoods you're not familiar with, really understanding what's happening, and then to step in to that conversation and to advocacy where there's disparity. In any situation, it will always exist if you look for it.
Right. Here's a broader, maybe even philosophical question. How do we define fairness when it comes to these issues? Obviously, some people will take the more equal outcome approach. Some people will take the more equal opportunity approach, and some combinations therein. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. So, and not to get too deep, but my mother-in-law grew up in East Berlin under communism. So I'm relatively familiar with the concept of, equal distribution of resources. Mm-hmm. And there's ways that can go really wrong. Sure. But I do think that the concept of fairness is important for us to just continually self-examine with, of is anyone struggling here unnecessarily? That's really the angle in my mind. Is anyone struggling unnecessarily? Has anyone been blocked or had a challenge or struggle that I didn't have, or that someone else who had some sort of privilege didn't have, right? And so if that's the case, then how can we help solve that? It's not that you don't consider the economics, but it takes a step back from that, a step before that.
Personalizes it.
Yeah, yeah. Is there any group that has a smoother path and others have a rougher path, and that's leading to an unequal outcome? And that's really, I think, where the concept of fairness comes in. Yeah. Are there barriers that we potentially even unknowingly have put up? Sometimes it's intentional. Sure. But, are we examining those barriers and saying, does everyone have equal opportunity and equal access? Right. And are they enjoying the fruits of these opportunities in the same way?
Yeah. And I love that you're involved with one race in Atlanta, because I haven't done an academic study on this, but my personal view is that the best way to be able to confront these economic challenges, there's really two options. There's macroeconomics and there's microeconomics. The macro would be at a public policy level. The microeconomics, I think, is where the church can have a more direct influence more quickly. And in my view, the best way for the church to influence the microeconomics is for there to be spaces, whether it's congregations or movements like One Race, where across racial lines, we can actually be close enough to feel each other's pain. Because if there's not that closeness, how will we know if a barrier is in the way? We can't be everywhere at one time. And so if you look at the church, our responsibility is to be in relationship across economic lines. And so I think that is a practical way of being in a position where we can actually see the problem, because if we can't see the problem, we're never going to do anything about it.
Yeah. So actually, our church had a sermon on this a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, that I think speaks exactly to this. I hadn't quite realized that call to be in relationship across economic lines. So we were talking about Pentecost, and we were looking at the people who were gathered there and thinking about how diverse they must have been.
Right.
And then out of that was born the church, and the church suddenly became a really tight community. Now, in that context, that church was crossing every line.
Yep.
Oh my goodness. It was racial groups. It was economic groups. It was guilds of, people with different labor skills. It was everything. And so if that was the first of the church, right, how are we pursuing that today? And it's not easy. You have to work really hard to be able to, like in Dallas. People probably don't go into some neighborhoods that would actually reveal the pictures of what's happening in Dallas, right? You have to go out of your way. But I agree. I think we're called to do that. And I think Scripture just shows us that as the model of the early church, and that's what we're invited into.
Right. In a 2015 report, you stated that 73% of Americans and 94% of evangelicals agree with the statement, Christian churches play an important role in racial reconciliation. So you would think, okay, 94%, that's a pretty high number, feel like there's something to be done. If we're not reconciling within our congregations, what do you feel most evangelicals at this point feel their role is in this issue?
Yeah. So I think, and I'm going to give a preview of some research we've got coming out.
Sure.
I think the reality is people don't know what they're saying that they believe in that case. I think the understanding of what's required for reconciliation, whether it's racial or economic or anything, is very, very light in most church contexts. And so we're doing a study right now called the Multi-Ethnic Church. It's coming out in September.
Awesome.
It's with Michael Emerson. If you
Divided by Faith, United by Faith. Yep.
So it's kind of meant to be a part 2 to that. And he's writing a book with a certain angle. And our angle is, what does a healthy multi-ethnic church look like? And one of the things we've learned in doing a very large survey of practicing Christians and then those outside the church, but also doing focus groups at churches, all types of churches. We've done about 30 focus groups. Is that when people say things like that, they actually don't all mean the same thing, and they don't always understand what they're saying. So they're like, in theory, we should be so good at this because we understand what it's like to be reconciled to God. Yes, that is true. But all the other stuff doesn't necessarily follow.
Right.
They don't really understand what it takes to be aware of and empathize with someone who's different than them. They haven't made the effort to step outside their comfort zone, and they don't understand what it looks like to engage in justice issues that are required to have that racial reconciliation. And so we have just been blown away by the learning curve that the church has. People's hearts desire it, but they have a long path to go to really, truly empathize with what's needed to get to that place.
Yeah, that's really good. I'm looking forward to reading that and being able to hear your research. Practically, what are you seeing as some success stories in that journey of maybe churches or Christian leaders that are doing the work of racial reconciliation, actually understanding it correctly and seeing forward momentum in that area?
Yeah. So I will say this is a tempered success story, which is the successes are hard. And so people recognize that. There's a reason God told us to count it all joy when we face certain trials, because hard produces good, right? So where we see successes, people are also weary. They're tired. They've labored hard for a long time, and it takes so much patience to have a success story. However, when you see the fruit of reconciliation, it's beautiful, and God gives us a glimpse of the kingdom. I guess the models where we've seen that have been the most successful are where minorities or people of color are in the top leadership positions in a church environment. That's essential because we don't realize how white our culture is. And so if you've got an all white or even primarily most senior leaders being white, they often don't realize the implications of things that they haven't even seen in their own culture on people of color being a part of their community. So leadership structures that really exalt minority leaders in that environment, I think is super important, and empower them. That's really been a success story. And then those churches that have had the most thriving congregations are the one where they've almost like stripped away all of the norms and traditions and the I'm comfortable with or I'm used to's of church and said, what are we doing here? What we're doing here is worshiping and praying and being with the Lord, not just coming to learn an intellectual thing, but to experience that together and to experience the Lord together.
Yeah.
That's where we're really seeing fruit. So it's a huge shift, I think, for a lot of churches. You can't just adopt that. It's easier to plant that, which is why church planting is a place where that tends to take place.
Right.
The members of those communities, where it is a healthy environment, they just see God's hand and their faith just grows. They're just so blessed by that.
Yeah. So let's talk a little more specifically about the way that we do church. How do we maintain a unified culture, but still make room for diversity? How do we make sure we're moving in the same direction and on mission together, but then also accepting different iterations of what that can look like? One complaint against the concept of multiculturalism is that taking too far, it's actually chaos. And on the other extreme, you can have where it's extremely monocultural and it's like very hierarchical and this is the way we're doing things. If you don't fit this, you're out of here. So how do we deal with the concept of the other in our churches? And a couple of the studies that I've seen on Barna that I think you've been involved with, one of them let people know that the number one point of data and feedback that you hear from young adults is that there's no place or voice for single people. And another aspect of this concept of otherness is generational diversity.
Yes.
And you said that oftentimes people can use the labeling of generations in a judgmental way. How can the church balance believing that marriage and generational diversity are a good thing, but also not othering single people or people of a different generation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a complicated thing because it's got to fit every unique context. But I think some of the principles would be, one, to seek to know and understand. That's always step one. And that's going to be true of generations. That's going to be true of ethnic groups. That's going to be true of just my church tradition versus yours, right? So seek to know and understand. If we really love that person, think about what it means to love your neighbor. If you really love your neighbor, and this is more than your neighbor, this is your brother and sister in Christ. If you love them, you want to learn everything about them. You want to discover the hidden beauties that God has placed in them, right? So coming at it with that posture of seeking to learn and understand is absolutely the most important thing. Most things fall from there. But the other, the next steps is to look at our programs and say, is it totally weighted towards one group or another? And it can be weighted way too young, or it can be weighted way too old if you're going to just make those distinctions by generation.
Right.
It could be accommodating maybe the early founders of the church who are now, grown and aged in a certain way, and it hasn't really evolved to accommodate those who are younger in a different life stage. Vice versa, we could be super focused and seeker-friendly on bringing in the young generation and then neglect to respect and incorporate our elders. There's quite a lot of that in the church too. So I think for you to have diversity in terms of generation in a church and a sense of feeling of belonging in a church, all those kind of programmatic assumptions have to be stripped away. Oh, well, we have to have a married ministry or a men's and women's ministry or whatever those might be, really dissecting those things and saying, like, what is that saying as a message that we have these programs, and is it allowing a place for everyone and where they really feel welcome? And the point about married versus single is actually the trickiest one because, so many churches, you want to celebrate and uphold this image that God has given us of union, right? It's a great thing, but not everyone's in that at the moment. In fact, increasingly in the church, it's almost half and half people who are married versus single. So celebrating just the individual, not only the family or the couple, is a shift that I think a lot of churches have to make. So just kind of looking with a critical eye across programming and structures to say, where we made a place for everyone.
Yeah.
And then the next thing I think in terms of steps to take would be make sure those people are at the table. If you haven't given a voice to people of different age groups, even to men versus women, then, and of course, ethnic groups, then you're not going to realize if you're making a place for them, because again, we don't see that through the same lens. So you really do have to ask, what can we do to help you feel more a part of this? And that's a wonderful opportunity to help bring leadership opportunities to people across all different groups, not just to say, here's my feedback and I want you to fix it, but to say, help us to build something that is good, that makes you feel a part of this, and that feels authentic to who we are as a church. So I think deputizing or giving leadership opportunities to people in lots of different life stages and of lots of different backgrounds is also really important to make sure that we then create a church that's welcoming to everyone.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, I think so important is also the social connections of a church. And so many of the opportunities that come up are more socially driven than we would like to think. And depending on the stat, you look at somewhere between 60 to 80% of the jobs that are available just in the general workforce are what's called in the invisible job market. And that means that the opportunities don't go to the person that's necessarily best qualified, but more the person that's most socially or relationally connected. And I think the same thing can happen in our churches when it comes to opportunities. If we're not careful, it can be very socially driven in that, we need such and such person. Oh, well, Joe Schmo can do that. It's just natural human sociology. But I think it does take a shift in mentality and intention to say, okay, let's be intentional, not just to go who's most proximate to us right now, but what are we trying to build? What is the mission of the church? What is our community, and how can we reflect that and provide not just service opportunities, but social opportunities that will then lead to more sustainable service opportunities for everyone that we're trying to be as a church.
Good. That's good. Yeah.
So you mentioned programming. I had a funny moment a couple of months back. I was in a huge youth rally. There was maybe 1,000 high schoolers that were worshiping at the top of their lungs. It was awesome. And it just got me thinking, man, you hear the stats about people leaving the faith after high school or stopping coming around church around that age and things like that. And it got me thinking, man, what exactly accounts for that drop off? And I'm sure you guys have done a ton of studies on this, so you can feel free to critique what I'm about to say. Obviously, a part of that is people moving away to college, is people getting their driver's licenses and having more autonomy. But one of the questions that I had in terms of programming, a lot more budget tends to go towards high school ministry in local churches than college ministries. So to ask it pretty harshly, have college students given up on the church, or has the church given up on them?
That is a really good way of putting it. I think it's both. So there's actually a few ministries that work to help integrate college students into a local church. But we were actually just talking about this with our team the other day because we're working on doing a study on faith on campus. And one of the things we realized in talking to some of the ministries was these ministries become the church for the students. So these students say, hey, it's good. I don't need to go to church because I have my community right here. And that sets up a bad precedent, because then you think community is people who are in my same life stage and who act and look just like me, right? Because typically that's what's happening in these environments. And then you get into the real church, and it's really diverse in terms of not just what it looks like, but like people's opinions and their backgrounds and their life stages. And there's not really a sense of how to navigate that. And that's not appealing if you've just spent 4 years in an environment where you're all the same. You're all going through the same experience, right? So I think there's this divergence of like, we wanted to serve college students well by doing something special for them. But now 20, 30 years down the road, we're like, hold on. We've also set them up for failure to not be able to get back into a church because we've not helped them to learn how to be uncomfortable, how to do something outside of their comfort zone. And almost like engendered this sense of, I don't want to be too harsh, but consumerism, right? Of like, this is what I'm looking for. So I think you're absolutely right that churches haven't made a space. But I think also this general sense of like, ministry's not always working together and kind of abdicating like, hey, that ministry's got that covered. So, we'll just support that, but we don't need to make room for that here.
Right. Kind of the same approach that we take to our neighborhood outreach sometimes.
Exactly. Yeah. I think we're starting to see like, we wanted to make things more tailored for certain audiences, and it actually ends up creating some byproducts in the end that we wouldn't have desired.
Right. So looking at the overall witness of the church, whether it's to our communities or just to the broader culture at large, you had a quote that said, historically, Christians have been known for what they are against, and they stand up against things. But the church today needs people to stand up for things. Tell us more about this.
Yeah, so a lot of that's come from looking at what I'll call the younger generation. So you can say millennials, but young adults. If you just look from a media perspective, a lot of what you see is, yes, people standing up against certain things that are often, morally improper or, injustices. So that's okay. That's good. But we also need to see people standing up for things. And I think the youngest generation is expressing a lot of views. We're seeing that in our data of, I'm really tired of the narrative of the church, maybe not in my church, but from the church about all these things that we're against, this backsliding of moral culture in our country. And we're like, hey, rather let's just pick up the mantle and go do something. And that's really basically what we're hearing from young adults in terms of their desire. For them, it is so, so important. It's 44% of people who say, because of my beliefs, it's important that I take action, that I engage with people who are disadvantaged, that I look out for social justices, that I stand up for things. That's huge.
That Gen Z.
Well, that's actually more young millennials. Okay. It's like young adults, the 18 to 38 or 25 age. And so it's a little bit of Gen Z, but millennials. But I think we're seeing that in Gen Z as well. To some degree, it's a life stage thing. It's a natural thing to be more engaged at that life stage. But also, I think one of the refreshing impacts of our millennials and Gen Z is that they're waking the church up to places where we've kind of gotten stuck in a rut and maybe lost our focus on what are we trying to do here. And they want their faith not just to be a thing that happens on Sunday morning. It's not a social club. It's not a thing that I feel I have to do. It's something that integrates with my life every day. It integrates with my work. Right. It integrates with the way I interact with my neighbors. Yeah. It integrates with even what I pursue socially in the everyday of my life. And it, of course, drives a lot of the ways that I get involved civically. I think the church has a lot to learn from this younger generation in terms of what it looks like to stand up for something and that posture and language and tone that comes through that work, as opposed to always just standing up against something that looks like culture's not going in a way we like. Right.
One of the themes that I'm seeing come through a lot of these different points that we're talking through is making space for conversation from people who are different than one another, whether that's generationally or racially. So how do you see the church moving forward making these spaces? Obviously, a Sunday morning traditionally does not have these spaces. Right. Are you seeing any models that are working where churches or Christian leaders are intentionally bring people together in this way?
Yeah, so there's been a real, and we're about to get some new data on it. I don't have the latest figures, but there's been a real uptick in whatever you want to call them, house church, community groups, life groups, whatever that looks like, which used to just be Bible study. And now it's broader, and people really have a broader definition of what that looks like. So it's kind of a mentoring environment, basically, a place for conversation. So we're seeing that as one of the ways that people are creating space for that conversation, especially if you really craft those groups intentionally so that you get across generation and you get across different ethnic groups and mixed genders, then you get a really interesting microcosm of the church, right? So that's one of the effective ways. The other is really approaching it as, I hate to use the word programmatic, but it kind of defines what it is, like saying, hey, this is the thing we're going to do, and creating space for that. So a lot of churches have begun to integrate almost a curriculum, like a course they go through on what does unity look like. That can take lots of different flavors, but either they're using something that's available or they're creating their own curriculum. And those have been really effective. The only caveat I throw in there is they can also be, if you're in a really big church that does them frequently, they can be exhausting for minorities because you need minorities at the table, but that means they have to keep doing it while everyone else goes through it once. Right. They're great, but we also have to recognize the downfall of that too.
Yeah, I think it's so important. The moment you treat those discussions as marginal discussions, you also marginalize the people that you're inviting to them.
Yes.
And so that's, I think, one of the challenges is how do we make this our issue and not your issue that we're helping you deal with. Right. And I think that's one of the challenges that, like you mentioned, is easier to more naturally deal with if you have a person of color in leadership. I don't think it's impossible to do otherwise, but I do think that's one of the biggest challenges that the church is facing today. Any other studies that you guys have coming up or anything that you are excited to tell our listeners about on this topic of church, race, music, and economics?
Yeah, I love how you put all those together because I think it's great. So on our multi-ethnic study, actually, I thought you'd find this fun. We actually did a little experiment that is providing very interesting insights. During this survey, so it's an online survey, we showed pictures of different pastors of different ethnicities. And they were kind of similar in the type of church setting they were in. They're really just focused on the person, right? And then we played music while showing them this picture. and we played different types of music. We played a Hillsong, we played a gospel, and we played a hymn. And we said, is this a church you'd be interested in going to? And then we kept creating different combinations of them.
That's hilarious,
right?
and
so
amazing.
Different pastors, different music, right? And so we looked at, okay, across all the choices a person could make, looking at, the own respondents' racial group and how that compared to the picture they were seeing, what is actually going to draw that person in more? It was less the person in the pulpit. It was more the music.
Yeah.
Which was so fascinating.
Right.
And we're just unpacking a lot of the data of like, who is most drawn
That's
to.
what I've been telling everybody. So I'm
now.
glad to see the research is helping that.
It literally, we kind of hear it anecdotally and we're like, is it really just music or is there something else going on here? And then when we did that, we were like, no, it's really the music.
Wow.
Music, it becomes our language,
Yeah.
right? And so people want to worship in their language. And that's one of the things where I've been trying to say to churches, like, just be aware of, if you want diversity in your church, you're going to need diversity in your music, because you can't just do one thing and ask everyone else to follow along if that doesn't feel authentic to them.
Right.
So anyway, that was just a really fun experiment that we'll unpack in this study coming out in September. Yeah. All worship ministers are going to be like, yes,
yeah.
Now we get to dig into what the impact of our world is.
That's amazing. I'm personally very happy to hear that, because that's basically what we've been talking about the whole show, is that the music of the church has the power to shape the message of the church. And if you look not only at our Sunday mornings, but also at our Christian radio and these different things, the way that we portray Christianity and the frame that we put it in can either attract or isolate or push away people, depending on whether they feel that that is being tailored around them or specifically tailored not for them. And that's why I think multicultural, multi-ethnic congregations are huge, is because that can then, at a grassroots level, redefine Christian from being primarily white focused in terms of its music and a lot of the ways that adjective has been used historically, to being multi-ethnic, which is actually more true to how it was used in the church in Antioch originally.
Yes. And I will add on top of that, I just keep harping this, Gen Z is the most diverse generation we've seen yet. They will not have a majority race.
Right.
So if we aren't preparing that space in our churches, a whole generation is going to walk in and say, what is this? This doesn't feel like my world.
Right.
So I see demographics like defining our future in that way. We've got to learn how to do this better. We've got to learn how to create spaces that are welcoming and stretching for everyone.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Brooke. That was all incredible. I am so happy to hear all of your research on pretty much all four of these topics that we talk about on this show. So thank you for sharing. Thank you for the work that you and everybody at Barna is doing. How can people learn more about your work as well as Barna's work?
Oh, thanks for asking. We do a weekly article on one of our recent research studies called our Barna Update. But if they just go on the Barna.com website, there'll be a pop-up to sign up for that. And that is the best way to get the latest on whatever research is coming out and what our top findings are from that.
Awesome. That's Barna.com.
Yes.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, Brooke, thanks again. I appreciate your insight and looking forward to our listeners hearing this.
Thanks, Robbie.
Man, if you've been listening to Praise Hands these last couple seasons, you know how much we value diverse worship expressions. I knew there were a lot of things we could talk about on racial and economic issues with Brooke, but I had no idea about the study that's coming out in September about multicultural worship. I would definitely encourage you to check it out when it comes out. I know I'm stoked for it. All right, guys, if you're new to Praise Hands, make sure you follow us on Instagram at PraiseHandsOfficial. Second, if you want to learn more about what we do here, visit praisehands.com. You can click the About tab to learn more about our story, click Get Involved to join one of our growing volunteer teams, click Contact if you're a leader who's trying to figure these issues of church, race, music, and economics out and you might want to chat, and lastly, click the Donate button if you want to become a monthly or one-time supporter of this mission. Guys, thanks so much for tuning in. Can't wait till next week.